series on Sandhill cranes, and I want to introduce from the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, Jade Pederson, who's a visitor center services specialist and a volunteer for the center, Cynthia McSherry. So I'm going to turn it over to Jade and Cynthia at this point. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening in today. We are excited to share some of the quirks of sandhill cranes, why you can find several thousands of them at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge in the fall, and why I think that you should come give us a visit. I'm Jade Pederson. I'm the park ranger at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge Complex, and I have been working at the refuge for about 2 years now. So this will be my second season of seeing the sandhill crane migration at the refuge. And I'm joined today by Cynthia McSherry, and I'll let her talk a little bit about herself.
Good afternoon. I'm Cynthia McSherry. I'm a Minnesota master naturalist and one of the very many refuge volunteers. I primarily work in our education program. Jade?
All right, thanks, Cynthia. So we'll be speaking today about the crane's life history, their characteristics, and their staging at the refuge. We'll hopefully get to answer some of your questions like, why are they so loud? What type of sandhill cranes are found in Minnesota? What does a day in their life look like? And do they really have 3 eyelids? We will be having a dedicated question and answer at the end. So if there's any questions that we do miss during the presentation, be sure to ask them then. The almost 30,000 cranes, sandhill cranes that we saw at the refuge last fall can't lie. We are a critical place for migratory birds. And seeing those large flocks of birds is so exciting because it means not only are we doing our job, but there are groups and individuals nationally, internationally, contributing to the success of sandhill cranes. Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is a part of the National Wildlife Refuge System, which is actually the largest networks of lands and waters in the country dedicated to conservation of native species. And here at Sherburne, we have been serving as a sanctuary for migratory birds since 1965. Not only do we see sandhill cranes, although that is one of the species we're most known for, we also see bald eagles, blanding sturtles, red-headed woodpeckers, and countless other songbirds and migratory waterfowl. We have some pretty rare and special habitats at the refuge as well, including oak savanna, prairie openings, forests, and wetlands. And our 30,700 acres is located about 50 miles northwest of the Twin Cities, or about 30 miles southeast of St. Cloud. And while the wildlife at the refuge is our priority, there are numerous ways for you to come visit and recreate. And since you're all on this call, I know that you have similar interests to those of the refuge. Then we're excited to talk to you about some of our recreational opportunities later, one of those being sandhill crane tours. So first off, I'll say that not all cranes are the same. Sandhill cranes are one of 2 crane species that breed in North America, the other being the more rare whooping crane. And North American sandhill cranes are actually the most abundant of the world crane species and are divided into 3 non-migratory and 3 migratory subspecies. So the non-migratory subspecies include the Florida, the Cuban, and the Mississippi. All of these have relatively small populations with restricted ranges. The Mississippi sandhill cranes are considered a critically endangered subspecies with a population of only about 150 birds. And those cranes can only be seen at Mississippi Sandhill Crane National Wildlife Refuge. The Cuban population is also considered critically endangered, while the Florida population is listed as state threatened. And then there's 3 migratory subspecies, the greater, the lesser, and the Canadian. The greater subspecies is bigger in size than the lesser subspecies. And then the Canadian subspecies is a little bit controversial because there is some evidence that shows it's a hybrid between the greater and the lesser. So there are some researchers that are calling for the recognition of the subspecies to be abandoned and disclassified as greater instead. But those migratory subspecies are then split into 6 populations for management purposes, which is what you're seeing on the map here. And those are the Pacific Coast, Central Valley, the Lower Colorado River Valley, Rocky Mountain, the Mid-Continental, and then the Eastern. And in Minnesota, we see 2 of the migratory subspecies in 2 management populations. So this map shows us the migration pathways of those 2 sandhill crane populations in the state. So we're talking about the mid-continental population, which is seen green in that yellow area on the map. That's in Canada and northwestern Minnesota. And then the eastern population is an orange area seen in the Great Lakes region, Canada, and eastern Minnesota. So following the pink on the map, the mid-continental population migrates down into Texas, Mexico, and alternatively Louisiana, following the Missouri River corridor. And the mid-continental population contains both greater and lesser sandhill cranes, but has mostly lesser sandhill cranes and contains about 700,000 cranes. And I'm sure many of you have either attended or have seen photos of the Platte River in Nebraska, and that's the population of these birds. So the mid-continental populations are the ones that you're seeing at the Platte River. And then following the green area on the map, the eastern population migrates down to the coast of Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. They like to stay near sources of water, such as the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. And the eastern population contains mostly greater sandhill cranes and has about 100,000 cranes. And we've been finding that the eastern population doesn't always fly as far south as it used to. So during milder winters, they'll fly only as far south as they need to. And they've been seen wintering as far north as Kentucky. All right, sandhill cranes have commonly been referred to as dinosaur-like. And while modern sandhill cranes were not actually around when dinosaurs roamed, they did certainly evolve before modern humans. A crane fossil thought to be 9 million years old was found in Nebraska and is structurally identical to the modern sandhill crane. And it's thought that this fossil is actually an ancestor of the modern sandhill crane. The Sandhill region of Nebraska, where this fossil was found, is where the sandhill cranes actually got their name. A fossil found from 2.5 million years ago in Florida was confirmed as a modern sandhill crane, and that makes them one of the oldest known bird species still surviving today. And about 2.3 to 1.2 million years ago, the greater and lesser sandhill cranes diverged. And we're going to fast forward a couple million years to the late 1800s. The eastern population of sandhill cranes were nearly extirpated, which just means like locally extinct from their historical breeding range. And that was due to habitat loss and habitat alteration, as well as unregulated hunting. So by the early 1900s, sandhill cranes were considered rare in Minnesota. In 1944, there was only an estimated 10 to 25 nesting pairs in Minnesota. And then by the 1950s, people were starting to witness the gradual increases in the sandhill crane population. Between the 1900s and the 1950s, there was some critical conservation work that happened that contributed to the gradual increases, such as regulating the harvest of sandhill cranes and protecting and restoring their habitat. And then in 1979, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service completed their first eastern population sandhill crane fall survey, showing about 15,000 cranes around the Great Lakes region. And then since then, the sandhill crane populations, at least in the eastern population, have been increasing at about a 4.4% rate per year. And today, the mid-continental population in the northwest corner of Minnesota has increased enough that regulated hunting is allowed, although there is no hunting of the eastern population in Minnesota. And all of this information on this slide was taken directly from the 2023 Minnesota waterfowl regulations. So I urge you to refer to those regulations if you are interested in hunting sandhill cranes. And just as a reminder, there is no hunting allowed of sandhill cranes at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. So if you live around the area or plan to visit the refuge, Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge contains the greater sandhill cranes in the eastern population. These large birds have a really striking red patch at the top of their heads. They have a white cheek patch, and then they have a really long bill with mostly gray plumage. And both males and females look pretty similar, with the female being slightly smaller. And now if you're thinking, well, the cranes that I see are rusty brown, I must have found a new species. I will urge you to hold off on calling your local wildlife expert. Sandhill cranes have been seen with rusty brown colors, and this is because they like to cover themselves with iron-rich mud that stains their feathers. And they do this as a camouflage tactic. In the refuge here, all the mud that we have is pretty iron-rich, So most of the sandhills that we see are rust colored. But however, every spring when they come back from their migration, we do get to see their gray plumage. And if you live in an area with no iron-rich mud or soil, then you would always see them in that gray plumage. In the bird world, the greater sandhill cranes are pretty tall at 4.5 to 5 feet with a 6 to 7 foot wingspan, which is about the same as a bald eagle's. They can weigh anywhere from 6 to 12 pounds. 6 is pretty small. That's more of like a lesser sandhill crane. And they are about the same weight as an adult cat. The oldest sandhill crane on record was 36 years old, but most are known to live about 20 years. All cranes are omnivorous and their diet changes throughout the year. So in the spring, the sandhill cranes need a high protein and calcium rich diet for healthy eggs and chicks. So they'll eat things like insects, fish, and frogs. And then in the fall, they're looking for good energy for migration. So the sandhill cranes will readily eat cultivated food such as corn, wheat, and sorghum. Fortunately, most of this is waste grain that's left over from harvest. And before these cranes adapted and had access to these cultivated foods, they would have instead been eating aquatic plants with starchy tubers. And we also know that sandhill cranes are pretty fast. Depending on the speed and direction of the wind, the sandhills can fly anywhere from 25 to 35 miles per hour, but can go up to 50 miles per hour. And during their migration, they like to fly during the day at altitudes of up to a mile high and cover on average 200 to 300 miles a day. But if they have favorable winds, they can go up to 500 miles in a day. And when you next spot a sandhill crane, I want you to look out for these really cool crane characteristics. So they have these fluffy feathers in the back, sometimes referred to as the bustle, and they aren't actually a part of the tail. They're actually elongated wing feathers that are modified for display. And if you look closely while they're in flight, you might catch a glimpse of their relatively short tail underneath. And did you know that sandhill cranes have 3 eyelids? They have a top, a bottom, and a third eyelid called the nictitating membrane. So this eyelid closes horizontally over the eye to keep it moist and to protect it from debris and dust, especially on the long migration journeys. So in the picture that you see here, you can see that the third eyelid kind of just looks like a film over the eye. And a lot of other animals have this too, like raptors, crocodiles, and even your cats. And like turkeys, sandhill cranes have 3 toes on each foot with claws at the end. And these claws are very sharp and will be used as defense against any predators. Perhaps what sandhill cranes are known most for is their calls. So they are very loud and their vocalizations can be heard up to 2 miles away. They have very long tracheas that coil and reverberate within the sternum. And they also have enlarged vocal cords for birds, which is known as syrinx. In a 4-foot tall bird, which is more like a lesser sandhill crane, they have about 50 inches of windpipe. And so as you can tell that they have evolved with the emphasis on vocalization, so there has to be some importance to their calls. And while we don't quite understand all of crane vocalizations, because there's a lot, we will just mention a few to you today. So first we have the flight calls, which are the ones commonly associated with sandhill cranes. And we'll play this sound. Okay, so these happen more in flight than on the ground, particularly common as groups take off in flight together, and where it's thought that this particularly aids in avoiding collisions. In flight, they also have guard calls. So these are loud, resonant, wooden sounding bugles with rattling or rolling qualities. And these guard calls are described as dinosaur-like. Calls are also done on the ground and are thought to aid in intimidating predators and humans that might be too close. And then the second call that we have is the unison call. And I'll have you try to listen to the different pitches in this call. All right, so this call is a call between mated pairs, and the male is a lower pitch, 1-note call, and then the female is a 2-note call. And the duet's purpose is to strengthen the pair's bond and to protect their territory. Historically, the refuge used these unison calls to do mated pair surveys in the spring, but we no longer do those surveys anymore. We've moved away from the unison call surveys. So then the next call that we have is the purr. All right, and this one is a rather quiet, muffled click sound. It's used when feeding and also used for voicing flight intention. These aren't very easily heard, and they're probably quiet to avoid detection by predators. All right, and then in addition to calls, the sandhill cranes also use dancing to communicate. So both calls and dancing are used in courtship and mated pairs. So sandhill cranes are sexually mature at 2, and they'll wait as old as 7 to pair up. And when they do finally find a mate, they will mate for life. However, we have found that if they end up losing a mate, then the cranes will select another later on. They have these very elaborate courtship dances that involve wing flapping, bowing, and jumping, and they'll occasionally pick up a stick or grass clump and throw it around. And we know that there's 2 displays that are used to form new mating pairs, and then there's 3 other displays that are used between mates and serve to maintain their pair bond. But the dancing displays aren't just for mated pairs and courtship. We've found that they're also for motor development. But when sandhill cranes do finally find their mate and they are ready to become parents, they'll first start by choosing a nest location on a small isolated wetland. And they prefer breeding habitats that contain open sedge meadows and wetlands that are next to short vegetation and uplands. They'll nest in up to 3 feet of standing water, but some will nest on dry ground. And they're built of dominant vegetation like cattails and grasses. Some of the nests are built from the ground up. Sometimes they're floating nests and anchored to the standing plants. And we've also seen with water level changes, if the nest does get flooded, then the sandhill cranes will just re-nest, and then their colts will just hatch later in the season. The parents will lay 1 to 3 eggs and incubate them for around 30 days, with only 1 colt typically surviving till fledge meaning their first flight. And sandhill cranes exhibit this slow life strategy. So they live long, they defer breeding, they have low reproductive rates, and then they have high survival rates into adulthood. And this is similar to humans. Less than 20% of pairs successfully raise their young, and sandhill cranes actually have the lowest recruitment rates of any North American game bird. Although sandhill cranes do share parental responsibility pretty well, their success mostly depends on how many seasons the pair has actually been together. But when they do finally lay and incubate a successful chick, for the first month, the chick will have this yellow, burnt orange plumage that you can see in the picture there. They'll start by working out their long legs and their wings. They'll run around the nest and flap their wings, eating all the food their parents give them. And then finally, once they tire out, they'll sleep under their mother's wings. During the second month, the colts are rust colored and they have a gray plumage as well. They still don't have a red crown. And this is when the pre-flight training begins. And then on their third month, the colts are much bigger. You can see in the picture there, it's nearly the size of its parent. They learn to forage on their own. And then during week 9 and 10, they begin to fledge. And as I said before, that's flying for the first time. So in the first couple of months, you can imagine that they're pretty susceptible to predation. Their predators include coyotes, foxes, raccoons, and ravens. However, once they get to the size of their parent, they don't have nearly as many predators. This time of year is especially hard to tell the difference between a colt and a parent, just because they are the same size. But if you can get close enough, or if you can use binoculars, the easiest way to tell the difference is that the colts will still lack that red crown patch. And if you have good ears, the colts will have a different call than the parents. Their call sounds more like a peep, while their parents is more like a rattle. We know that the colts will stay up with their parents for up to a year, including their migration south to the winter. And on the topic of migration, I will pass this on to Cynthia, who will tell you about the sandhills at Sherburne and why they're here.
Thank you, Jade. So next, we'd like to speak more specifically about the sandhill cranes that pass through our wildlife refuge in the fall. In particular, do the numbers that we see in the fall reflect the same hunting and conservation patterns that have been observed elsewhere? You know, those patterns that Jay just spoke about. As previously mentioned, Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge serves as a very large staging area in the fall. Many of the eastern population of greater sandhill cranes pass through here and flock up before they continue their migration south toward Florida. While we do have some sandhill cranes that breed and nest on our refuge, and we estimate somewhere between 25 and 50 pairs annually, beginning in just a few weeks from now, thousands of cranes will congregate on the St. Francis Pool and on other wetlands of the refuge from October through November. Why do we see so many in the fall? You know, neither Jade nor I can really provide any definitive answers. And as most of you are probably aware, this is the reversed pattern of what is observed with the mid-continental population at the Platte River. At Sherburne, both the eastern population and some of the easternmost residents of the mid-continental population use the refuge to stage in the fall, while only some of the eastern population uses it to stage in the spring. I guess, well, one contributor to what we see might be that the crane groups are assumed to make more stops in the fall because they have young colts with them that are making their first migratory journey. And as you have, go back one more, please. As you have already heard from Jade, by the 1800s, the eastern population of greater sandhill cranes had nearly vanished from its historical breeding range due to habitat loss, habitat alteration, and unregulated hunting. To monitor sandhill crane populations that roost on the refuge, Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge conducts an annual fall crane count. We perform single-day counts on a weekly basis, beginning in early October and continuing until numbers begin to fall off. On this table, you can see that over the years, we have observed a gradual upwards trend in fall stage peak numbers. There were fewer than 100 cranes counted here that stage in 1992. Peak numbers are increasing as we go through those years, increasing. And as you might guess, during the years of the pandemic, it was much more difficult to perform the surveys due to the limitations placed on gathering of volunteers of staff. But last year we had a very normal procedure for our crane counts, and in fact, we saw record numbers of birds with a peak staging count of almost 30,000. The annual peak typically occurs at the end of October or early November, with count numbers beginning to decrease as it gets colder and it begins to freeze. Okay. Next one. There are three main reasons that cranes find Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge a favorable place to stage in the fall. Firstly is the migratory path. The majority of the eastern population of cranes breed across the Great Lakes region. That's Wisconsin, Michigan, Ontario, and Minnesota, as you can see pictured in the green area of this map. As it so happens, cranes really don't like to fly over big bodies of water like Lake Superior and the other Great Lakes. So when they migrate, they go all the way around the western end before they continue their journey south. And that place is Sherburne, shown with the red star here, directly in their migratory path. The next reason they like our location is safety. Beginning in the 20th century, there was increased interest in conservation of public lands. So, for example, the first National Wildlife Refuge was actually established in 1904. The National Park System was established in 1916. And in 1918, we saw the passage of the Migratory Bird Act, which, by the way, specifically included a prohibition against hunting sandhill cranes. Another important part of safety includes the presence of favorable habitat. Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge includes abundant wetlands for all types of migratory birds. In fact, prairie and wetlands restoration have continued to the present day. Water is very actively managed on the refuge. When we were established in 1965, the refuge was 34% wet. Now it's about 46%. And interestingly, sandhill cranes prefer pools with about 6 inches of water for roosting. And we have that. The third reason that Sherburne is a favorable site for the cranes is food. Jade discussed the omnivorous diet of sandhill cranes. In that regard, they've adapted pretty well. They feed off those harvested fields. Cranes stop to feed in order to gather energy for their continued migration south. Outside the borders of the refuge, we are surrounded on all sides by active agricultural fields. So sorry. Especially after they are harvested, those fields are easy access feeding grounds. Recovery of sandhill crane populations has been so successful that their range has actually expanding. And that could be another reason we're seeing more and more cranes at Sherburne. The eastern population is actually expanding further west. My apologies there. Okay, next slide. Next, we're going to take a brief, humorous, and very anthropomorphic look at a day in the life of an adult sandhill crane as they might spend it as they're stopping over with us at Sherburne. Okay. This is Dawn. Picture yourself as a crane standing in a pool of water, most likely the St. Francis Pool, where there is abundant shallow water. And remember, we cranes like to roost in water that's only about 6 inches deep. It's safe here in the refuge. You've been here all night, asleep. No need to worry because there are lots of sentinels present. You hear your family and neighbors begin to vocalize as they too greet the day. Stretch your wings, move your legs, just a bit at first. The sound around you gets louder and louder as more and more cranes awaken. No bird is in a huge hurry to be too active yet. Morning. Finally, like a pebble that's cast into a pool of cool, clear water that sends out gentle, rippling waves, a bird takes flight. And it's joined by its mate or its family group. Slowly, a few more, and then a few more go up into the air. They make their way out of the refuge singly, in pairs, and in small groups. North, west, south, east. There are agricultural fields all around us, and it's time for breakfast. In this photo, we see a great illustration of the flight silhouette of sandhill cranes. Unlike other birds, cranes tend to hold their heads and feet extended straight out while they're in flight. Next one. Daytime. During egg laying and nesting season, the crane diet contains foods high in calcium and protein. But migration is a marathon, and carb loading is more in line with what is needed. The Sandhills spend their daylight hours hanging out in the harvested fields outside the refuge, eating. Corn seems to be especially well favored. I've read that it's estimated that a single sandhill crane can consume about 400 kernels of corn per day. Colts in particular fare better when those corn kernels are cracked, such as found after harvesting. And speaking of colts, take a close look at this picture. Can you identify the colts that are present in this picture? There are actually two. Next. Dusk. Oh, it's time to head back towards the safety of the refuge to get settled in for the night. These cranes are preparing to land. Notice that their flight silhouette is quite different from what we saw earlier. As they come in, their landing gear is extended. Okay. And here we are, back in our shallow pool with all of our family and friends, where we will roost and be safe through the night. All right. Whether people are interested in coming out to see the cranes or just checking out to see what we've got at the refuge, we would absolutely love to have you here. During crane migration season, there are multiple different kinds of opportunities to see the birds. For example, we have pre-dawn sandhill crane tours. And these are just about as close as you can get to the cranes on the refuge. Refuge staff take you behind the gates on an auto tour to the crane roosting site on the St. Francis pool. These are scheduled in mid to late October, and they really fill up fast. People can register by calling or by email, and those numbers will be posted in the chat. But you don't have to go with an organized group. You can hike or bike in. And there are service roads to the water control structure near the main crane roosting site. There is a red dotted trail on that map that highlights one way that you can get back there, and that's probably the easiest. I think it's about a 2-mile hike in and back up. We also have sunrise and sunset viewing from dedicated parking lots just outside at the margins of the refuge, especially at the north part of the slide. You can see a red star. That is a special parking area on County Road 70 that offers spectacular views of cranes flying overhead in the morning going out, and again in the evening coming back in. During the daytime, the The cranes are out in the fields north and west of the refuge, the fields that have already been harvested. And if you choose to come in the middle of the day and go out to the fields, please remember to stay in your car, pull off the road. Don't disturb the birds, and please don't trespass in any fields which are private property. Okay, next. If you'd like to come out to the refuge before the peak of crane migration, I'd like to let you know that we do have a wildlife festival coming up. It's on September 30th. It will be from 10 to 2 at our Oak Savannah Learning Center. It's free. You don't even have to register. And there are going to be many family fun activities, such as dip netting for aquatic invertebrates, a wildlife discovery and exploration booth, a pollinator booth, opportunities to learn about seed collecting, a demonstration of bird banding, which I'm actually quite excited about. And there will be a BB gun range, food trucks, and lots more. So everyone is welcome, and we would absolutely love to see you there. That is the 30th of September from 10 to 2 at the Oak Savannah Learning Center. And that
Okay.
brings us to our question and answer session. Welcome back, Jade.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Linda, do you have any questions for
Yep.
us?
We do. So the first question, does someone actually count how many come into the refuge?
Several people do. We have a group of volunteers and staff that are on different points throughout the refuge, typically just around the St. Francis Pool area, and they physically tally each sandhill crane as it flies over them. They have a certain section in the sky that they should overlook, and then they tally the birds that they see for a certain period of time.
Okay, the next question is why are cranes hunted in Minnesota? This person feels it's cruel if they mate for life. Are they edible?
I can't speak to the why they're hunted necessarily. That's not on our level to decide. But that would be more the Flyway Council, so that would be higher up, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They must have determined that the mid-continental population would be able to sustain a harvest each year as long as it was regulated. I've heard that they're edible. I've never eaten them. They've been called the ribeye of the sky, but yeah, again, I've never eaten them.
Yep, just to follow up on that, there is that northwest corner that the mid-continental population can be hunted because the numbers did increase. So once the numbers do increase, they do manage for hunting. Let's see, do sandhill cranes typically return to the same places in Minnesota year after year?
Oh, that's a good question.
It is a good question.
Yeah, I would think yes, but I don't know if we have any data supporting that.
We don't band our birds. And so I would
Yeah.
also guess, yes, that while they're territorial as far as their mates go, that they're probably come back to the same area. And that's one of the reasons that we see the population that we have hanging around in the summer gradually increasing, both with some nesting pairs, but also with juveniles that aren't quite ready to pair up. We didn't talk about that, but we are seeing that group of individuals increasing. But again, no data to support the observations that we've made as individuals.
Okay, the next question is another hunting one, and maybe I can answer this one. Why do people hunt cranes? Do they eat them? And yes, hunters do eat them. And as Jade mentioned, some people say they taste like ribeye. They're very good meat. I've never tasted one, but it is a meat source. That's why people hunt. There's a big push for organic meat and knowing where your food came from instead of in the plastic cellophane and the My questions are going fast. In the grocery store, you know where your food came from. Okay, let's see. Next question is, do cranes ever nest in prairie near ponds, but not right next to the ponds? Like, I guess the question is, do they nest in the pond or on the land next to the pond?
They would nest in the wetland. Yeah, in the pond.
Okay, and
Or just on the edge of it.
they build up a nest just like loons do then on the pond.
Yeah, so it could either be a standing like on the dry ground just on the edge of the wetland, or it would be in the wetland and it would be a floating type of a nest.
Okay. Another, why do people hunt cranes? Again, it's a food source, and it's an organic food source. You know where your bird's been. Okay, this question, this has been one of the best presentations I've seen so far. Perhaps it's just because I love Sandhill cranes so much, but I also truly love the day in the life segment. That was awesome. So that was a nice comment.
Thank you.
Oh shoot, my questions disappear on me. Hold on. Can you volunteer to aid in the migration count? How do people go about becoming a volunteer for you?
So if you're interested in becoming a volunteer at the refuge, you can either give me a call or give me an email. I think there was an email address in the chat, and I can send you on how you can become a volunteer at the refuge. Currently, we're not looking for volunteers for the migration count, but there's several other volunteer opportunities at the refuge, including other biological surveys that you could help with.
Okay, so you broke up a little bit, but if you call or email Jade, and that information's in the chat, you can volunteer, but they're not looking for migration counters right now, but they are looking for other volunteers. The next question is at the Wildlife Festival, what time do the roads open up to the public?
So actually,
The roads.
the refuge is open from sunrise to sunset every single day. So you can come in anytime. But as far as the activities at the Wildlife Festival, those are going to be between 10 and 2.
Yep, and I'll just add that there will be open service refuge roads that day,
That's right.
starting at 8 a.m. and going until 2 p.m. So those roads will open at 8 a.m. that morning for the interior of the refuge.
And that's particularly fun group. The gates are usually locked except for just a couple of days of the year. So areas that are difficult to access except for by hiking or biking in, you can actually take your car and see those. It's really fun.
And what great timing right before the Refuge Festival. That's great. At what age do the colts develop the red patch?
They would within their first year. I can't say for sure when. It's probably when they're down and migrating in the south for the winter.
Okay, the next question, what do they eat when they land on a lawn? I thought they only ate field leftovers. Aren't they vegetarian? Sorry if I missed this information. She was late.
They are omnivorous, so they will also eat like snails. So maybe you have some snails in your lawn. Maybe you have some other type of invertebrates there. They will eat beetles like in the spring in a field that doesn't have anything in it yet. They might be eating the bugs that are in that field. So they're probably just eating the bugs in your lawn, maybe some grubs.
Okay, so yep, they're omnivores, so they eat plant and animal. So this Carol mentioned she has personally has a pair of cranes that I believe are the same individuals that inhabit my land every year.
That's interesting.
On the website, it says that there is a bird checklist, illustrated bird checklist, and Sandhill crane brochure, but I can't find any links to them. Are these online or just printed at the refuge?
Currently, they're all just printed at the refuge. The Sandhill crane brochure will be uploaded to the website soon.
Okay. Is there a website with updates for when it is the peak of migration, like similar to like the DNR has that fall color update? Do you update your website for peak migration times?
So there's two different ways that you can look for that information. One, if you are on Facebook, you can go to the Friends of Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, and there's posts there weekly on the crane count. Otherwise, if you go to the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge website, the one that I linked in the chat, on the homepage there's weekly updates as well.
This was answered, but maybe this person was late. But do we know what the cranes ate before the corn was so common?
Yeah, in the springtime, or excuse me, in the fall, instead of eating the cultivated grain that they do now, they would instead eat the starchy tubers of aquatic plants in the wetlands. They just have adapted and eat the easier source of food, easier to come by source of food, which is the cultivated grain.
We had the Mississippi Refuge talk about the trumpeter swans also ate the starchy tubers when they migrate down there. The next question, the cranes seem to chatter a lot when they return after feeding. Is this to locate family members or do we not really know?
I can't say for sure, but that's probably a really good guess, is to locate family members and yeah, make sure they're not getting too close to each other, especially if they're going off in flight soon after.
It is a good guess.
Okay, the next question, Kim says, we have a family living in our backyard pond new this year. Do you think the drought has changed their living situation? How can there be more water in the Sherburne National SNF, whatever that is, Sherburne, when we are suffering from drought and some ponds have dried up? Where does the water come from?
Yeah, so our main water source for the refuge is the St. Francis River, and we do have an impoundment system on the refuge that allows us to sort of control water levels kind of based on need. So we know that the Sandhill cranes like to go to the St. Francis pool, for example. So maybe we would keep more water there in the fall. But again, when they're nesting, it's only up to 3 feet that they like to be in. But then when they're roosting for their migration, it's only up to 6 inches. So even if you have just a little bit of water, that's still what they prefer.
Okay, are there any current population studies that will be looking at longevity or migration in Minnesota? Is there going to be efforts in the future to band individuals?
So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service still does the Eastern Population Migration Survey. They also do a Mid-Continental Migration Survey, and those can be found online each year. As far as I know for banding, I haven't heard anything about it. That potentially could be something that they're looking into in the future, but I haven't heard anything about it so far.
Okay, the next question, what are the key differences between the lesser and greater Sandhill cranes?
Good question. The biggest difference is size. So the lesser Sandhill crane is about 6 to 7 pounds, while the greater Sandhill crane is about 10 to 14 pounds. And then the lesser Sandhill crane is about 3 to 3.5 feet tall. And then besides the size, it's just the location of their populations. So the greater Sandhill cranes are located mostly in the eastern population, while the lesser Sandhill cranes are mostly in the mid-continental population.
Okay, so in Minnesota, we have the greater Sandhill cranes.
And the mid-continental ones in the northwest corner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any specific pollutants or water quality issues that significantly impact the cranes?
Good question. No, I haven't researched into that very much, so I can't give a good answer on that, unfortunately.
Yes, and I haven't read anything either.
Okay. What is it about Sandhills in Nebraska that make it such a popular spot for cranes?
So that population has 700,000 cranes there, and they most of them will all go to that spot. So you'll see several hundreds of thousands of cranes there. So that's why it's so popular, is that there's just a huge volume of cranes there versus at Sherburne, we have only which is not only, but we have tens of thousands instead of hundreds of thousands.
Mhm.
And the other thing you guys mentioned is that in Nebraska, it's a spring migration that people go look at, and here it's a fall migration people go look at.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. I don't think there's any other questions from the population, but you're saying that every year it's been increasing about 4%. But when I looked at the data that you showed from 21 to 2022, it went from 13,000 to 29,000. That's a 45% increase. Why was there such a huge jump that year?
I think one thing that Cynthia mentioned is it might have been how much we were actually able to survey in 2021.
It's called sampling error.
Just
Okay.
yeah, but I can't say for sure.
Mhm.
But we've also heard that the eastern population is migrating more west, so maybe more cranes are just coming here. Maybe it was a drought year. There's no certain reasons that we know of yet why they might have all come last year, or why the difference in rates were. So
But
Okay.
if you plot those numbers on a line graph, the number that we had last year actually does fit on a trend line to make us believe that we know that that's a real number.
Okay, so it's just they're doing better. Another question came in from
Precisely.
Susan. Can you speak about Aldo Leopold's role in the recovery of Sandhill cranes?
I haven't looked into it. Cynthia, have you heard about all the
I
Leopold's
haven't
role?
not. I wish I could answer that question
Yeah, I'll
nicely.
have to look into that.
Yeah, it makes me want to reread Aldo Leopold.
Carol
Yeah.
thought, I would think the pesticide use on insect population could potentially affect fledgling success in the future. So maybe that was part of it. Okay. I think that's all the questions. And you did say they mate for life and they tend to breed when they're about 2. Was that about it?
They're sexually mature when they're about 2, but they hold off on breeding and nesting until they're closer to 7.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
they have this really slow life cycle, kind of like humans do.
Okay. So if they wait till 7, do they just wait to pair up with their mate till they're 7?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
sorry.
Okay, I don't think there's any other questions, but what a great opportunity for the participants who are watching to come to the Wildlife Refuge. Is it next Saturday, September 30th? I think it's not this coming Saturday, but next week, Saturday. You can go to the refuge and participate in a lot of activities and get to meet. I'm sure Jade will be there, and maybe even Cynthia will be there. So a great opportunity just the following week on September 30th, go to the Sherburne Refuge. It's a beautiful, beautiful location. So I want to thank Jade and Cynthia for doing this presentation today. I really appreciate it. And for those watching the Moth series next week, September 27th, the talk will be planning a DIY, do-it-yourself bird hunting road trip. So for everybody else, we'll see you next Wednesday. And again, thank you to the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge for giving this presentation, Jade and Cynthia.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening in.
Thank you for coming.